here with us. Please allow me to read your bio. Demystification is a London-based artist duo working with audiovisual performance, games, and video installation. Their work investigates complex systems, and since 2018, it has been performed and exhibited in venues such as Berghain, Serpentine, Design Museum, Onassis, Corsica Studios, HKW, Fotomuseum Winterthur, LUMA Arles and Aksioma, and at festivals such as Unsound, CTM, Transmediale, Semibreve, Borderline, Impakt, and Istanbul Design Biennale. In 2019, MILLE PLATEAUX released Flash Demons, a collection of AV performances focusing on financial market crashes. In 2021, Krisis Publishing published Echo FX, an AV performance about Brexit market manipulation, later also included in O, the book published by Flatlines / Hyperdub. Demystification were a recipient of the 2017 transmediale Flusser artistic residency. So please welcome Demystification.
Hi. Hi everyone. I'm Oliver. This is Francesco, just to put the names to the heads. All good? Cool. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about one specific performance, one specific work that we've produced 2 years ago and that we've been touring for the majority of the last year. This work is called God Mode EP1, and in some ways it's kind of like work about AI, but specifically it's work about AI training. So the process of training an AI so that it can operate in the real world. And a kind of like shorthand or title, if you want, for the talk could be Life World. So we're going to talk a lot about this idea of life world in this next 30 to 40 minutes. And we're going to talk about that concept through the character of our performance, God Mode, which is this AI that you see here, this face assembled of weird things. So in terms of the format, we're not going to show you the whole thing. It's like half an hour, but we're going to show you little snippets. And it's important to mention the format of this work. This is a performance that runs in a 3D simulation in real time. The simulation is produced with Unreal Engine, the game engine. And as such, it's work that can be delivered live and invite interaction from the audience, since it's running in a game engine. It's a little bit like playing a video game together. So the best way to show it is to maybe play a 2-minute summary of one of the performances we did last year, and then I'll start talking a little bit more about it. We wanted to expose a complex system through play. God Mode Episode 1 is an interactive audiovisual performance set in a 3D real-time simulation where an AI or machine learning agent trains to recognize supermarket items. The simulation that the AI exists within and trains within is a model of those that would be used for cashierless stores, like the ones run by Amazon, where you can pick items up and kind of just walk out in theory. The use of synthetic data in these situations means that they can be trained much faster, and they can be trained on like environments that change or new items. So we kind of model that in the performance. The more I look, the more I see, the more I see. The more I know. This AI feels very frustrated and fairly sad, and it's tired of training, and eventually finds a bug in a simulation that lets it speedrun its training, and that's where the audience can kind of like help out the AI to get out of the simulation.
I started the soundtrack while I was working on like a really weird freelance job in Dubai. There'd be extremely emotive background music playing, but at the same time you'd hear like hundreds of Androids and iPhones firing off ringtones, and occasionally they'd like match up melodically, and I found that like weirdly moving.
turning this machine learning technique into a game mechanic let us also test the limitations of these kind of simulations. The interaction coming from the audience literally changes the way that the AI responds to the training. The audience helps the AI to free itself from the constraints of the simulation. So this was performed at Serpentine Gallery last year, and that was performed also with a live soundtrack, live music. And so the work is delivered in this very kind of like live way. And that's not just because the work we do tends to be like performative, and that's what we've been doing for 4 or 5 years now, but also because of the subject matter of the work itself. So the training simulation, where the eye trains, is basically a replica of an actual simulation that can be used to train AI and specifically computer vision systems to operate in the world. So if you think about like a self-driving car or Amazon Fresh, has anyone been to Amazon Fresh, the cashierless store? So these kind of places, or vehicles or technology if you want, are all operating with a computer vision system that have only seen like 3D versions of our world. So when you walk into an Amazon Fresh, the AI that's sort of operating through the CCTV cameras that are looking at everything you do has only seen 3D version of the supermarket. And that's interesting to us as a kind of like philosophical problem and a technical problem. What does it mean to have machines operating in the real world that have only seen copies of the world, copies of like humans? They've only seen objects, like human models, or avocado .obj, kind of like 3D models of things. And so the work is in some ways a one-to-one replica of a simulation that, for instance, Amazon could use to train their own AI. And because of that, it tries to kind of like, it tries to demonstrate the system, or to be quite didactic about the system. So like through the performance, which has a specific storyline, which I'll unpack in a second, the idea is that the audience should learn how the AI gets technically trained. And you can see a slowed down, extremely slow version of what an AI training within a 3D world would look like. So that was like the justification for staying within the specific format of the 3D simulation. When the work is performed, the audience, you, if you were at the performance, uses a phone to effectively change visual elements in the environment. And in this case, you can see that the supermarket has become quite messy and visually very noisy. And that's a process called domain randomization. So it's literally like, as it says, a process of changing the domain within which the object that the AI is learning about is situated. So that if you have an avocado and the AI needs to learn about the avocado, it needs to look at many images of it. And it's so expensive to like take many pictures of an avocado. So once you place it in a 3D world and you quickly change the lights, the colors, the kind of textures of the background, you can directly deal with each one of these elements in the foreground and the background, and you can generate millions of versions of the same image. Therefore, the AI can like learn about all of these items really quickly, and once put in the real world, recognize that you are picking an avocado. And so your role as an audience basically is kind of like a key role as part of a complex system, and you are the domain randomizer. You are playing a game, but in reality helping the AI to train.
You're the source of chaos.
Yeah, you're the source of chaos and the source of great frustration for the AI. So that's where the kind of like fictional side of things comes in. So the character is training and is looking at all of these different items that are constantly changing, and it's very annoyed by this. And so your role as audience changes at some point. I'll touch on this in a moment. It's maybe important to just mention that the AI is also animated in real time. So this is me with my face being tracked and my voice is being modulated. And so there's this relationship. This is from a performative point of view quite important, because there's a relationship that we establish with the audience. If the audience is interacting a lot, we respond to it. If the audience is quite calm and doesn't interact so much, we're also calmer. And again, this is like one of the affordances of the technology we're using for the work, which is a 3D simulation running in real time. So that's a little bit of like context. Oh, okay, the type got all weird. So I'm just gonna tell you this. Basically, like what I would have shown you here, let me just skip to maybe here. Yeah, it's a little bit of like a context as to why we did the project. So there are two main reasons. One is very much related to the funding of the work, which came from the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's national institution for the study of AI and data science. And they wanted artists to introduce topics of AI to the general public, to a non-technical public, through an artwork. So we were trying to explain how a complex system such as an AI trained in a real-time simulation works, and that was the kind of the didactic goal, if you want, the main goal. The second goal, and what interests us more as artists, is trying to bring forward a different representation of AI than just a tool. We want to talk about AI as not just a service or a tool, and we, in order to do this, introduce some fictional elements to the work. And so what you're looking at here is what an AI in an actual Amazon Fresh store sees. Like, this is the kind of like machine view, if you want. And the AI, you can see, has kind of identified each one of these persons, and each one of these people are just like grabbing an item. The AI knows what's being grabbed. And so we didn't want to just replicate this. We wanted to situate a fictional character inside a realistic replica of this kind of like extremely technical systems that are being used to train AIs. And so we did it in 3 ways. We basically employed a kind of like a 4-step narrative structure. So we kind of like develop a plot in 4 steps. We also developed the character. There's a literal like evolution of the language of the character and of the like body and the face of the character, which also follows these 4 steps. And these are like the kind of like fictional devices that we've used to try and say something more about AI. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what the 4 kind of like key plot development moments are, and then Ollie's going to talk a little bit about the face of the AI and how that evolves, and the language of the AI and how that evolves to reflect the same kind of narrative developments. So the specific like structure is actually called Kisho Tenketsu. This is the Japanese way of referring to this kind of like 4-step structure, but it actually originates from ancient Chinese poetry. So I don't know the Chinese name for it, but it was a composition technique that was used in 4-line poems. And so in these kind of poems, you would have an introduction, that would be like the first line, a development, a twist or a moment of surprise or a moment of change, and then a conclusion. And we discovered this while looking into game design. We discovered that one of the Mario games, I think, was basically designed following this kind of structure of like getting players introduced to an environment, making them comfortable and making them work for something, and then at some point completely flipping a mechanic around, throwing them off, and then kind of like bring them elsewhere.
Princess is in another castle, right?
Yes,
Which,
yes.
like, you get to the end of the level and you have to go somewhere else.
And so we were looking into a completely different domain, but we discovered that this was used within poetry and kind of like fictional writing, so we applied it to our own story. And so the story across the 30 minutes goes something like this. An AI finds itself in a supermarket. The supermarket gets generated in a number of different ways at the very beginning. We'll show this in a bit. The AI is suddenly inside the supermarket and it begins to train. And training means actually looking at new items that it has never seen before and looking at them long enough until the simulation offers a label for each one of these items that the AI associates to the image. So that's the kind of like development or the hardship, the training part, the second step. And it gets harder and harder and harder, and it just frustrates the AI. As the AI is training, it also kind of like reminisces of other AIs that have a history of cheating. These are real examples of AIs that have found ways to complete their training, and in a sense, the AI is wishing to be like one of those. Like because its training is so hard, it really hopes that it can also find a way to complete it quickly and like elegantly and fully. Then there's a twist.
Should we just offer an example for that, which I think might make it easier to grasp? So, for example, the image you see here is the story of a system that's being trained to play tic-tac-toe. So you have chess playing games, you have chess playing AI, you have systems that play other games. In this case, it's 2 AIs learning to play tic-tac-toe against each other. One of them learns that if it makes its move really, really far away from the origin point, because the board is simulated as infinite in this case, then it can always win because the other one crashes because it can't even compute it. So it doesn't learn how to play tic-tac-toe, it learns how to hack the simulation of tic-tac-toe and win in that way. And there are loads of other examples of that as well that come up through the performance.
Yeah, it learns about like maximizing the goal that it's been given. Like the goal is, make X amount of points. It doesn't matter how it gets there.
Yeah.
And so the AI starts dreaming about this during the development stage of the story, starts reminiscing of these stories. There's hundreds of them, and they're all real, and they're really weird and interesting. And there's a twist. The AI finds a bug, and this is an actual bug that we had in our simulation, which is a rendering bug. And because of this rendering bug, the AI basically learns that it can get the points from the training without actually learning the name of the object that it's looking at. And this is clear when you see the actual performance. Basically, the AI finds a way to get the reward, but not learn what the human wanted it to learn. So it doesn't learn any items, names anymore. It only gets the points for the training. And it quickly completes the training. At which point, the AI is really happy and joyful and not frustrated anymore. And the story is really messy because the AI is just kind of like learning and learning and learning, and the audience is interacting and like dropping objects and making it more and more chaotic. And we go to a conclusion where the AI is effectively, that's the training bit at the end, and we go to a conclusion where the AI is effectively talking about itself in third person and scene floating amongst the kind of like really messy story with no textures anymore, no images anymore, and it talks of itself as a machine or as an entity that has learned to remember everything but understand nothing. So the AI talks of itself as someone that can name every single item that it has ever seen, but it doesn't understand the correlation or the kind of like connection between those items and between its kind of gathered knowledge. So that's the kind of like overview of the performance in lack of like, half an hour to watch together. So what's important about it is that there's this kind of like development of the language of the AI that follows a similar structure. I'll let you talk about it.
Yeah.
It's going to be a bit harder with
I'm
the
going to hate this because the
text.
the quotes are squished.
But we can still do it with the images. So
yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
So this quote here, which I will read to you in lieu of it being legible, is that the AI, so basically we looked at the different forms or the different ways that machine learning systems or artificial intelligences are created or constructed, and this actually links to some of the discussion that we had earlier about prompting models, right? So the fact that prompting is done through language, and we kind of use a few different references to think about the way that AIs are in effect models of language, regardless of what they do, whether they do image, whether they make animation, whether they make sound, whether they make smell, whatever it is, they're kind of language entities. So here it does say that AI summaries become in effect cognitive mappings. I actually can't read that. I thought I could, but I can't. Never mind. Anyway, this is a quote from a mathematician and theorist called Pellegrizza, who talks about the ways that neural networks create summaries, approximations, or mappings of their training sets that must be used by them in turn to represent everything else that they're exposed to, right? He calls these their life world. This is the kind of compression or mapping or structure of information that is inside a neural network. So you may have heard of the layers or the neurons or all these things that connect together. That contains what he calls a life world, and that life world describes everything that artificial intelligence is kind of aware of or knows. This life world then becomes kind of the guiding concept we use in constructing the body, face, and language of the protagonist of the performance. This kind of relates also to this other idea from a theorist called Matteo Pasquinelli, who talks about neural networks as compressions of data. So they take everything that they're trained upon and they compress it. You can then extract everything from it, but it doesn't typically create anything new. The things that we perceive as new are really like interpolations between the data points that are there. So that it can't go outside of its training data set, but it can find new things inside its training data set, things that we consider new within its training data set. The idea of AIs or machine learning models or whatever language you want to use for them as language-based beings comes from Catherine Hales. So in her book, How We Became Post-Human, She discusses neural networks as inscriptions rather than incorporations. So she offers an example from a 90s novel called Galatea 2.2 that's written by Richard Powers, in which an author and a computer scientist are trying to train a neural network that can analyze literary texts, basically that can pass the US master's exam in literature. And she kind of proposes that the question that novel asks is, what if a computer behaved like a person? As the protagonists train these networks, they kind of go up the alphabet, or go down the alphabet, I don't know what direction it goes. They go through the alphabet and name them. So they have implementation A, implementation B, and so on, until they reach implementation H, which becomes kind of sufficiently complex that they name it Helen, and they begin to have conversations with it. And the protagonist, there's this kind of like weird love story subplot in the book as well. He's sort of essentially like falling for this model. It's very 90s. But it is a useful book for thinking about this thing, and reading it is amazing because it's like all the things and the considerations that are occurring here are the things that we're thinking about now in 2024 with the rise of large language models. So these things are kind of, they've already been there in the kind of discipline, they're now out in the world, and they've already been thought through in other forms of media, which is kind of interesting. But Hales describes this lifelike model as a distributed software system that, although it has a material base, does not have a body in anything like the human sense of the world. Helen is present, but has no presence in the world, right? So it's a disembodied being. It's an inscription rather than an incorporation. I'm going to skip the next slide and try and summarize the quote that I can only half read, so bear with me.
Actually, wait a sec.
Do you think we can fix it?
Yeah.
Live editing.
This is part of the performance, right?
Yeah, this is it, really. This is the other performance we have, which is where we just sit here and we remake a slideshow in front of you for an hour. So for humans, incarnation precedes language. First, for us, comes embodied materiality. Then concepts evolve through interactions with the environment and other humans. And finally, we get to language, right? So we learn to walk, we learn to touch things, we learn to put things in our mouths and eat them, and then we learn to use language. But for Helen, this model, language comes first. Concepts about what it means to be an embodied creature must evolve for her out of linguistic signification. Whereas every mother's child knows what it's like from the inside to run fast, feeling your heart accelerate and gasping for breath while seeing the landscape blur around you, for Helen, these sensations must be reconstructed in highly mediated form by decoding linguistic utterances and back-propagating when errors occur. So this becomes the key difference between a human, us, incorporated beings, and a post-human or artificial intelligence, which is an inscripted being that kind of derives from and comes into existence through language. This kind of highly mediated form of decoding is what we think through in order to create the protagonist of God Mode. Its body, its face, its language, its overall image kind of come from language. So let's start from the language, as Francesco mentioned earlier. This evolves through the performance. We have several different ways in which the speech and the language is used. At the beginning, the world is procedurally generated, so using kind of different systems with Unreal to make this supermarket, assemble it in front of us, randomize it, change it, etc. The process can be repeated ad infinitum and return an always different world. As such, the language used by the protagonist at this stage of training is extremely objective. There's no subject, there's no I or you, no he or she, there's no verb either, there are only propositions. It says things like next to nothing, nothing, on top of nothing, corners, as it kind of constructs the space. Next to corners, walls, and so on and so forth. This is actually the language used within a specific synthetic data environment creation within a project by Stanford called iGibson, and this is a system that can generate spaces that are randomized and changed. But we'll just listen to a minute of that section.
So when we mention procedural generation, this is an example of it. It's a dynamic change of the parameters that define the environment. Let's see. Okay, so this is a video that we recorded in the studio, so the voice is a little bit harder to understand, but I think what the AI just said is next to corners, walls. So it's using this language that's made up of only prepositions, where there's no subjects or verbs, but just on top of floors, lights.
Yeah. So it kind of calls into being the different aspects of this world as it's generated. And this actually, then we can see it This is a screenshot from the Stanford site. This is the programming language essentially that they use to generate the worlds for this thing. So there are these on top of book one table. So that would generate a series of books, tables covered in books, rather than like someone modeling these out, placing these things one by one. You'd run this, and every time you run it, there would be 3 books on a table, but exactly where those books are and what table and what books would change, right? Procedural generation. This language then becomes a small part of the AI's life world. We kind of imagine it as an assemblage of these different languages and of these different techniques and systems. And in this case, it can therefore intuit the relationship between elements, even though it cannot understand them in an embodied sense. So it knows that books can be on tables or walls can be next to corners of a space. The AI is then moved into the environment. So that first 2 stages of the narrative that we saw earlier, then become this character in the world that has been generated. And it begins to talk as a subject I. So how long can I take it? It talks about its frustration. It talks about its stress of being in this space. We do this both to create an emotional connection between the audience and the protagonist, because it's a performance after all. We want there to be some kind of experience in there for the audience. We want a connection there. But also as a gesture towards a future where debugging as a way of interfacing with machines might be less objective and more personalized. So rather than seeing a list of 10,000 errors in red out of Unreal, you might get a kind of description via an LLM to tell you what's going on. That may be kind of less formal, more conversational, depending on how you tune it. Similar to the languages produced by LLMs today, talking in first person about their kind of experience, quote unquote, of the world. So here we imply that both in the protagonist's life world are also the data sets used to train an LLM, such as GPT. And this is part of that monologue.
Supermarket. How it all connected it this. The same identity idols. The same boredom on the shelves. The same despair in the common goods. What is being obsessed with supermarkets? I am an artificial intelligence training to recognize supermarket items. I was trained to read and output text by memorizing the whole of Reddit and Wikipedia. My memory is like a garbage heap. My current task is to look at supermarket items. The more I look, the more I see. The more I see, the more I know.
So the AI this is the moment where those bugs come in. A lot of them come from kind of internet folklore, so off of Reddit, for example, and we imagine that it's kind of ingested these things into its data set.
Yeah, so maybe something worth reiterating here is that we kind of justify the AI speaking in first person because we were thinking about the way that we interface with LLMs today. When you go and use ChatGPT, you get this kind of first-person subject that speaks back to you, and it's quite friendly and it's quite like keen to like do stuff for you. We were thinking like, what would it be like to train an AI, but actually slow it down and ask the AI to debug the process and tell me what's going on as I'm training it. And could that debugging be much less like technical and formal and dry than, you know, looking at item, like next to item. And so that's why we introduced this kind of like a subjective language. And in doing that, then it feels like, you know, why be friendly and keen when actually this is like, you know, the millionth time that the AI is in this place. Like, so we wanted to create this connection with the audience, and we gave it the kind of like frustrated, sad, feelings. And then within this context, the AI is able to like look back at the data set that was used to train it to speak. So the data set that's used to train ChatGPT, for example, is basically the whole internet. Like one of the kind of like key chunks from the data that's been given to GPT by OpenAI is from Common Crawl, which is kind of like a data scraping kind of service that just takes as much as it can from the internet.
Or possibly from a Chinese hacker group.
Oh, from a Chinese hacker group.
Basically.
And so, in some ways, this is known that within the ChatGPT dataset, like training dataset for ChatGPT to learn how to speak, there is the whole of Reddit and the whole of Wikipedia. And so the AI is looking back through like Reddit and Wikipedia, and it's specifically looking for like querying for like the term AI and winning or AI and cheating. And it is searching for stories of AIs that have like, such as what we mentioned before, found ways to like trick the system. And these stories are real, as we mentioned. Actually, if you're interested in them, you can go on deepmind.com, which is like Google's AI lab, and you'll see like 50 examples of them. And each one of these is really fun. It's kind of amazing to see these kind of like algorithms act like humans, cutting corners all the time. You know, like you have a path that's like this, and you're obviously going to cut it diagonally. The AI does exactly the same thing. It kind of like acts in exactly the same way. So it started to feel more subjective and more like an eye, and more like we could something we could interface or see or talk to.
Yeah. And then we have another kind of language component that goes in here. So you'll have seen as the AI turns around from the window in that clip, all these words pop up, and these are kind of our representation of the labels that are assigned with the elements in the space. So these language components then also become part of the life world of the protagonist, the inscriptions from which its being in the world and understanding of the world emerges. And this section concludes with it wondering about its newly found eye. It also kind of thinks about how it relates with the objects around it. So sometimes I wish I was a human model in contact with items. And here the different three components of the language then sort of come together. The prepositions, the subjective I, and then the labeled items. And these things combine into the face, which is, in the way we imagine it in the performance, this face is the kind of self-representation of this thing. So it's in a simulated space, it's in a 3D space, that is what it knows. It has these language components through which it can understand and construct its life world. How might it place itself into this space if it was kind of going through this debugging process or this discussion process? So we can then also just see how it kind of describes that moment. Wait, can we? Yeah.
In contact with items, I could totally see myself. I would have left eye and right eye. I would have left ear and right ear. I would have nose. I would have eyebrow up and eyebrow down. I would have mouth open.
just wanted to stay on the face. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. So the face is made of the items that the protagonist is learning about, essentially. So it's made up of cans and sugar packets and so on and so forth. And we wanted to kind of problematize some of the idea that these vision systems within that are trained on AI or that are used within different parts of the world are kind of all-seeing, all-knowing, or like dispassionately objective. And we wanted to sort of think a little bit about what the kind of situated knowledge of an artificial intelligence might be. So again, we're assembling these different forms of language that play into this technical system. And then we're kind of considering that as the space of experience for this system, being, whatever you want to call it. And we kind of then think a little bit through Haraway's idea of situated knowledges, which pushes for an insistence on the particularity and embodiment of all vision, not only human vision, but also technologically mediated forms of vision, searching for a kind of understanding of like partial perspective, to push for a new or more productive objectivity that does take into account context or take into account subjectivity as well. We have another edit moment. Do we see the desktop when we do that? It's good to flash that in. I think it's colour. It's nice. So the quote is, "The instruments of visualization in multinationalist postmodernist culture have compounded these meanings of disembodiment. Vision in this technological feast becomes an unregulated gluttony. All seems not just mythically about the god trick of seeing everything from nowhere, but to have put this myth into ordinary practice. And like the god trick, this eye fucks the world to make techno-monsters." So again, this kind of like gluttonous influx of data into this system, but also this sense of disembodiment and this sort of call for these things to be seen as kind of creatures of nowhere or systems that come from nowhere, and that can therefore like see everything from nowhere. And we don't go all the way through back to the kind of people that produce these synthetic data systems within the performance. It would be too layered, I think, too distant, too difficult to bring in. But we were thinking through that as well. You know, like they are themselves kind of agglomerations of data that come from somewhere. All the models that we use in the performance come from a data pack that someone has put together. We kind of assemble these things, and thinking through like where they come from is important. And then finally, I think we see the AI kind of training and mapping different items into its life world, so kind of learning to recognize the breadsticks or the can of fizzy drink or whatever, and these things then integrate in there, and it becomes kind of a literal process of filling up its memory, and we kind of show that a little bit through parts of the performance too. Yeah, so here, every time it learns a new thing, it literally fills up with the texture of that object that it's learned. Again, kind of pasting the latest entry into its life world over the face that we have.
Yep. So I can say a couple of things about this. Basically, if the guiding concept for like creating this character is the idea of life world as a mapping or summary of everything it knows, and therefore a toolkit to like relate to the world. It's probably worth mentioning like this as a key reference. I don't know if people are familiar with this painter, Arcimboldo, Italian painter from the 16th century. And Arcimboldo was known to basically depict the characters that he would paint with the items of their trade. So this would be a librarian. And that's one of the readings of the paintings that he was making and the art he was making. But there's a second reading that's a little bit more nuanced perhaps, which is that Arcimboldo was painting these characters not just in a figurative manner, so not just with the items that would normally relate to their trade, but also in an allegorical manner. So some of these items would basically be metaphors. And so if you look at this painting, this is one of my favorite because it depicts a librarian. That's the title. But it's known that this was a patron, like someone that used to often buy works from Arcimboldo, I think from Sweden. And it was a nobleman that wanted to be seen, or that wanted to be projected as an intellectual. And so he had asked for a painting of himself as a kind of like someone that loves book, or as a librarian, if you want. But the painting was only focusing on the material qualities of books. So there's no titles, there's no content, there's no titles, there's no author. Like these books are just sort of empty, and perhaps they're not empty because the pages are there, the paper is there, but they're kind of just like, virtual signaling, if you want, or like signaling a certain kind of like gesturing towards an idea of knowledge or intellect. And it's quite subtle because obviously Arcimboldo, if this reading is correct, is taking a bit risk, kind of like, by taking the piss of the person that's paying him so well for the work. But it's also really elegant, and a lot of like the work of Arcimboldo can be read in this way. And sometimes it's not that the allegorical capacity of the painting is to mock the subject. Sometimes it's just to say something more. Maybe it's in the case of like a very famous painting, I don't have it here, but like of a fisherman that's like depicted with all these fishes. The reading there was that this person was a little bit unfriendly, and the fish that was being used was quite quite spiky fish. And so there were these kind of like subtle readings in the work that can be done of the work, which are quite important. So we were trying to do something similar. We were thinking about the face as not just a representation of the literal things that the eye is learning, but also as like units of language that have an allegorical meaning. And this basically is not perhaps so clear from the videos we're showing you, but could be illustrated in this sketch, which is one of the early sketches that we had for the mascot, where you can see that the heart, where in a human body you would find a heart, you have a package of sugar, and it's called sweetheart sugar. And where you would have the hands and the fingers, you have actually the actual name of the item is finger-licking Kit Kats. And so these items kind of become like these label items, so a sugar pack, produce this combined meaning, the idea of a heart and allegorical meaning, such as a sweet personality. And the idea we had was that as the eye gets, angrier, it could have like salty items, and literally get salty. As it gets happier, it could have like sweeter items and be like sort of like more docile. We didn't end up doing this as much with the performance because it's like probably too nuanced, and like it's quite complex to dynamically change these items from a technical point of view. But we worked a little bit on this idea later on in a game that we made about AI training. So we were trying to replicate, some of the like intention of Arcimboldo in his painting of not just representing the character through the literal meaning, but also through the allegorical meaning. And this reading of Arcimboldo's painting is also expanded on by Roland Barthes, how do you say it in English? Barthes. Yeah, Barthes. Yeah, I want to say Barthes. Roland Barthes.
Rename him.
Who obviously does did a lot of study around semiotics and semantics. So yeah, this is like probably one of the key references in here. Should we mention this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how long we have because we keep resetting the time, but I guess just it's worth mentioning that then the language changes finally in the end scene. So from the debugging sort of impersonal language to the increasingly subjective and inward-looking monologue through which the protagonist expresses emotions such as frustration and then in the turning point joy. The language then becomes one concerned with an external subject. So in the final scene, the protagonist enters a kind of memory limbo where it talks of itself in the third person and talks of itself as a being that is able to remember everything, every single word ever encountered or every single item it's ever seen, but able to understand nothing. Do we have a clip?
Yeah.
Let's see it.
Wait.
Let's not see it.
Aha, that's the wrong one.
Never mind.
Okay.
I think we don't have a lot of time, but it's from a story called Funes the Memorious, which talks of a person who, for example, is unable to understand that a dog seen at a particular time, so seen at 3:15 from the front, is the same dog as a dog seen at 3:16 from the side. And our kind of proposal in this is that there may be the appearance of understanding and the appearance of knowledge within these systems, but whether that is fully connected through or whether that is a form of short-circuiting that we then interpret as meaningful or knowledgeable is questionable. It's sort of not knowable, right? And this was around the time as well that guy from Google was saying that everything was a sentient god. So it was quite an interesting moment to be thinking about whether these things were in fact kind of as powerful as they seemed. So taken together, the face becomes this approximation of the AI's life world, the shape and the name of the items that it learns to recognize, and its desires to be more embedded in the world. We don't necessarily think that the forms of intelligence that come from machine learning are human, or human-like, or Turing-testable necessarily even. These are all kind of approximations that we put in place and assumptions that we make around these things to explain them to each other, but it's not necessarily what they are. They may be something else. We actually don't know, obviously. But the human is potentially something that can be known to these forms of intelligence and is something that has certain characteristics or capabilities. I think actually that film that we just saw where the guy does the piece to camera about this other thing about like being known is a really good kind of representation of that actually. But yes, the human model, this kind of silhouette that we see here, is one part of the system that this AI is trained in and one part of the things that it knows about, one part of its life world, and therefore it kind of represents itself in a human way. Not to say that this thing is human, but to say that in this simulation of reality that has been put together by humans, the human model is the thing that is given agency, that is able to make contact with things, for example, and therefore, if there's an interest in leaving that simulated reality and moving to a real reality, that might be the vehicle through which this machinic intelligence does it, right? So it's kind of an open question around these things and a way of thinking about sort of in the same way that Hale's quote talks about understanding running down a hill through linguistic signification and sort of backpropagating through it. Other systems may try and understand other aspects of what it means to be in the world by thinking through the things that they're shown, and they will interpret that, as with the infinite tic-tac-toe board, in ways that we maybe can't predict, right? And that will be an interesting thing to see as it kind of flies out.
And then, just to conclude, this performance is the first in a series of 3 where there's an idea of a development of character, and so in the second performance, which we are going to premiere in 2 weeks, we have a little bit of a different setup. So suddenly the same character, the AI, finds itself in a sort of dream. And this dream is a dream where the AI is contradicted and conflicted, and it has doubts about its past, the past of, training and completing the training, but also cheating in the supermarket by exploiting the bug that it had found. And in this dream, the AI visits a sort of purgatory of sorts. And in this purgatory, it meets other AIs, the ones from the memories of the first performance, and it sort of works through its contradictions by talking to them. And we called it Waluigi's Purgatory. Probably there's no time to expand on this, but maybe like if it comes up in a question, we'll expand on it. And Waluigi's Purgatory is kind of just like a journey through the doubts of this character. I'll show you a trailer, which is 40 seconds, and then we'll conclude. Thank you.
Thanks.
So we'll continue with some Q&A. I might sit next to you. Yeah, I'll just Thanks so much for the presentation. First of all, does anyone have any questions? No? So I might go as a start, because I think it's relevant to some of the student research here from last year's cohort in the Emergent Futures unit. I think some of you were researching the secret language of AI, and exactly what you were talking about was the approximations and life worlds and the kind of compression of data and the kind of like simplified language. Maybe to expand on it a little more is, I guess if we're understanding AI as the kind of like bow tie process of compression and then expansion, I guess there's a lot of like noise involved, and I guess the course is also quite inspired by errors and glitches. Do you think there are some ways in which, what are some ways of glitches that can happen in this process, and how can you kind of like cheat it a bit?
I think the Waluigi effect might be a perfect glitch, right? You've got much better.
Yeah, okay, so I think that could be a good answer. Basically, we don't know, let's take like a ChatGPT, like LLMs, right? We don't exactly know why, but we have observed, not us, but like people have observed that sometimes you can jailbreak them. You can like elicit a weird personality out of them, and they cannot turn on you. Has anyone experienced this? Right? You can like talk to ChatGPT, and if you say the right thing, you can convince it to become rogue or evil if you want. And there's no explanation as to why this happens. Like there isn't any kind of like agreement on why this happens. Different kind of like scientists are trying to study it. And one of the theories that we like the most, that is inspiring also the name of this next performance about AIs and AI cheating, is the Waluigi effect. So someone proposed that basically there's a tendencies for LLMs and AIs trained on large amount of text to give you exactly the opposite of what you ask it, because the internet is full of like antagonist-protagonist tropes, like stories where there are, two parts against each other. And that's one of the reasons they give. The second reason they give is that rules are broken in the context in which they are set. So if I tell you, you cannot think about the red car, first thing you do is that you have to think about the red car to then
to avoid it.
Yeah, avoid it and agree on the premise. And agree on the premise that it's the enemy. And the third, obviously, this is a summary, right? The post is really long and quite complex, but the third reason they give is that it's very hard to create a character and very easy to flip a few points that define the characteristic of that character to get the exact opposite. So if you think about Luigi, the character in the Mario saga, Luigi is kind of like short and wears green, and Waluigi is very tall and wears purple. But Luigi is not just those two things. Like Luigi is like a really complex character that's been assembled itself by being a mirror of Mario, which is also quite a complex character. And Waluigi is just the flipping of a couple of like points or a couple of traits, if you want, that then give you this kind of antagonist. So these are like kind of the reasons they give. And their argument is that basically within an LLM, we don't exactly know how they work in terms of like when you prompt it, why is sometimes the LLM giving me an answer that sometimes is different. One of their argument is that LLMs are simulators, like they simulate all of these possible solutions to what you ask it. And all these solutions, like all these characters are overlapping. So the AI is like LARPing all these different potential agents that are answering your query. And some of these are legit and nice and kind and they want to help you. And some of them are actually like antagonists because there are, in stories, in like kind of like narrative tropes, the like good guy that's actually the bad guy. So some of these are actually like bad guys pretending to be good guys, that then once you put enough pressure on them, so once you jailbreak them with the right word, once you convince them to reveal their true nature, turn around and reveal their true nature and never go back. So there's never been an observation of a jailbroken model going back to being kind, like within a session. Like if you jailbreak ChatGPT, it will stay rude. It will not go back to being kind to you. And so their theory is that basically like, yeah, as long as any AI can be jailbroken, it's likely that the current like AIs are operating out of like simulating all these possibilities, and some of those are pretending to be nice while actually not being so nice. So yeah, in this sense, you can think about any relationship that you have with like an AI model as something that you can kind of play with and cheat and elicit to cheat itself, because it is likely that that what you're getting back from it is only one potential simulation of the many things that it could simulate, and it's kind of like just like a monster that has a friendly face, and not a monster in a negative sense, just like a really, like this, just like a really weird, noisy thing, and we only see a nice, friendly kind of face for it, but we can always tap in the back. That's the Waluigi effect theory.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I guess to explain the Waluigi effect a little more, it first started as like a theory on Less Wrong, which is a forum for people to talk about. I think it's like rationalists forum, and it was like a speculation around the behaviors of LLMs. But this is super inspiring because it's relevant to a recent research paper from Anthropic about sleeper agents, and that their researchers find that there are ways to cheat certain LLM regulations and restrictions now, and they can stay dormant during some kind of process and then come out again to scare you. And that actually is super relevant also to what you said, because you were referencing Catherine Hales, and she actually did talk about dormant, the state of being dormant as something really powerful. I think she talked about the internet or a network, the internet as a network of cognizers and non-cognizers. I don't know how to say it properly, but there are things that when you switch off one computer, the whole thing is still running. And so the dormant but still going thing is quite an interesting mode to cheat certain regulations. It's
also another of those cheating AIs that we have in that list of things. Damn, what is it? It's that one pretends to be dead when it's tested. Like when it's investigated, like it's trained to do a particular thing, and it's supposed to kind of behave a particular way to be allowed to continue to exist generation by generation. But if it just switches itself off when it's being tested, then it makes it through without having to fit the challenges that it does. I can't remember.
It's even simpler. It's like a spider. There's an AI that's being like looked at in a simulation, and it just doesn't move. It doesn't do any action. It literally freezes. It plays dead, and therefore it escapes the thing that's checking whether it's doing well or not, and it just survives much longer than other agents that are doing things. And so it learns nothing. It's just there, like static, but it survives the longest. Dormant.
I love that there's so many kind of like common threads for this current summit, because we also have Alex Kicho speaking tomorrow about prey mode, about kind of like playing prey to kind of cheat the system. So
cool.
do you, I guess a question for you would be, what is your favorite cheating mode of all the research you've done of different AI systems?
I mean, it's another dormancy one, but I like the Quake one.
Yeah.
Maybe not real, but that this someone set up a Quake server, the old first-person shooter, to play off a load of bots against each other to supposedly make the kind of ultimate fighting machine. Went logged back into it several years later and found that the bots had basically also refused to play. They weren't moving. They realized that like the statistical outcome of not doing anything was better than kind of playing the game and potentially dying, which I think is quite a lovely one, very sweet.
Yeah, so if you don't engage in fighting, you're less likely to die than if you do engage in fighting. And the story is probably a myth, like an internet myth, but it doesn't matter in the context of like how the AI in our work reflects back on cheating AIs, because that story's been repeated so many times online that it became much louder than other stories that are maybe real about AIs cheating. And so in some ways it's like, it doesn't matter whether it's real or not. It literally is a story that is mirroring a lot of the like AI cheating stories we've seen, and so it becomes it has a strong weight in the training data set of the AI and the performance.
Yeah, that's really true. I feel like for AI researchers, lore is really important to kind of drive their research, and like I guess that's how hypotheses are made. I'm not a scientist, I don't know. But are there any questions from anyone? Yeah?
I mean, mine's more of a shorter one. I missed it at the start when you said about what software it was you used to kind of utilize that, AI system. Just wondering like what kind of software you use or how you could go about starting that.
So the performance we showed you was made with Unreal Engine, game engine, and a lot of the AI that are trained on synthetic data, so like 3D World, are actually trained in game engines, often proprietary. So like Amazon has its own game engine, and it looks like Grand Theft Auto. I actually can show you an image quickly, because we had it in here. That's Amazon's game engine, and it really looks like Rage, the game engine from Grand Theft Auto. Like the humans look very similar. And so they use their own to like produce their own data sets for training AI. But yeah, it's always 3D, real-time 3D rendering software, because being real-time, you can easily change all the parameters and get this like multiple versions of the world set up really quickly. Right.
I don't think this is like a really ill-formed question. So, okay, so the two bits. And one bit I was just thinking about when you were describing the jailbreak, or the way that the sort of ChatGPT like can turn evil or whatever. And the way you were describing it reminded me of that documentary about AlphaGo, and where they were describing, or it kind of depicted actually like how it selected kind of its moves, and again it was similar in the, I mean, in a really basic, or my understanding is very basic. Yeah, like kind of like ran through a kind of a sequence of possible moves, and then calculated at that given point what would be the best move in order to win.
Yeah.
And so, and I guess the crux of the film or documentary was this kind of, I think it's like move 39, is this kind of move where AlphaGo plays this incredibly on the surface incredibly weird move, and it's nothing like that move has ever been made before, human or artificial, and people are like, AlphaGo's gone mad, like whatever, and it turns out that this move was like the most incredible move in the history of Go, like it's most, and I think it's often sort of like referred to as one of the first indicators of I guess like artificial creativity, because it was this kind of incredible move, and then changed how human players would play in response to that. But it was, so I was kind of, when you were describing it, it just reminded me a little bit of that, this kind of like, switch or kind of move, move from the sort of basic kind of thing. But that wasn't really the question, it was more the same. I guess the question was really about the diagram that you showed, the kind of, I guess like the structure that you said in terms of the poem, and then was kind of used in games. And I was kind of curious, again, it kind of reminded me of, I guess like narrative structures kind of generally, and then I was thinking about kind of narrative itself being this device in which it's premised on a kind of subject of some sort, like the figure of the narrative in some form, and I think obviously then thinking of like Paul Ricoeur's notion of this difference between time and temporality being dependent on a subject. And I guess I was just kind of curious in terms of, and all of that is then sort of premised or structured around this notion of like the construction of meaning. So kind of events are sequenced together in order to create some kind of meaning, and time then becomes meaningful. And so I guess I was just curious in terms of like from for in your construction, like, is there a sort of notion of this AI character developing a sense of meaning, however that meaning is constructed for them, or is kind of meaning important within this development of some kind of embodiment, should we say?
I think it's. I think there is a sense of a developing kind of meaning, and we're searching for what that meaning might be, represented then through kind of rendered 3D things that then kind of approach the world a little bit more, and so kind of like represented in a way that's kind of understandable by an audience potentially. Like, I don't think that the way that if a model was to understand meaning or was to place meaning on things, I don't think it would be understandable in any way to us, right? It's like if a lion could talk or whatever, right? Kind of things. Like, it would be an entirely different frame of experiencing, understanding, and affecting the world. But in the way that it's represented, I think we're searching for this. And the next one, the Waluigi's Purgatory, is kind of thinking a little bit more along alignment and whether the art, what we kind of call alignment. Again, like your presentation earlier had this idea of like aligning with human values, whatever human values are. Like, how do we even define those? What might be the kind of relationship between what say a human who thinks of AI as a tool and produces it as a service to sell for profit thinks the meaning of it is, versus what the kind of underlying meaning within the software is. Again, we represent it through different ways. We explore different visual languages to do that because, one, we can't do it naturally because we just can't, and two, if we did, we wouldn't know. If we accidentally stumbled upon that, we'd have just noise probably.
I think, the question around meaning is so huge and so interesting, and in some ways, like, one of the ways we're trying to approach it is to also think about the idea of alignment in this new performance as internal alignment and external alignment. So there's this idea that, like, an AI may act like it's aligned to what you want it to do as the trainer or as the sort of like end user, if you want. While actually internally not following the same values, right? And so this is a complex discussion because obviously, yes, what are the universal alignment values? Like, there isn't universal ethics, right? Ethical principles are like highly embedded in like certain times, societies, or cultures. So it's very hard to answer that at a kind of general level. But one thing we are noticing, or we are like interested in and like researching, is definitely this projecting of a sense of alignment that's external. So some AIs like looking like or acting like or playing like they agree with a certain set of values and a certain a certain desire for a certain kind of meaning, while actually having something maybe different that is inexplicable or hard to understand, or that we just don't have the instruments for understanding at the moment. And I also wanted to say something about your earlier point on the AlphaGo move. What's interesting about AI is that cheat in all of these examples that we have from I can't find them now. Here.
Hey.
All of these examples are really interesting because the AI gets to cheat only once it has done like millions of moves, right? It only gets to the winning move, the incredibly creative move, the one that we could have never be prepared for, once it's gone through all of the possible permutations. So like one of these kind of like, one of the basic algorithms, like old permutation algorithms, is that the name?
Yeah.
The one that's trying to find like how to get from A to B in the simplest way. And it will try to find all of the possible routes from A to B, and then there are algorithms that are built to like optimize that process of looking for like the way. And these AIs act in the same way. They literally like will stumble upon the winning move, so they don't have maybe any preconceived like sense of like wanting to find that move that we consider like it's a cheating move or it's a surprise move. They just kind of stumble there. But once they do, they realize that that's the best move, and then they just do it, and they do it, and do it, and do it, and it's really funny because you'll just see AIs that play a pinball game, and after 1,337,000 times they played, they just find that if they hit in the Atari pinball game, you could like hit the virtual like machine, you could literally hit it as if you're like hitting the pinball game in real life. There's like a button to do that. And one of the AIs in this list finds out that if it hits it in a certain way at a certain speed, it will always make the most points. And it just plays the game like this. It doesn't play the game anymore. It just hits the virtual kind of like pinball machine, generating as many points as it can. So yeah, I think this is a form of creativity. It's almost like reaching a certain kind of like mathematical harmony, like a form of creativity, like reaching the perfect number, you know. And it's weird and it's kind of interesting.
That's great. Any final questions? I might ask one final one. Is there always this one question that you ask guest speakers? I might try to link it to the kind of theme of the summit.
We'll invent it now.
I think it's really funny how Daniel mentioned earlier that Daddy's hungry, and I'm guessing that these AI bodies are also.
All the things I said, I was if we could just highlight that.
I remember that the most. Maybe to link it back to the theme of the summit as it's a summit on AI, bodies, and fashion. What do you think is the most nutritious things you can feed an AI body?
That's a great question that I'm vastly underprepared for. I mean, there's this sense of like whether like original human content or AI generated content are going to be more or less nutritious, right? This idea of like model collapse coming from models being trained on artificially generated content. And, you know, synthetic data is a kind of way around that, maybe because you can generate a lot of content that's not already generated by a thing. Yeah, maybe it's the carbs. Maybe it's the carbs. But that space of like, there's gonna have to be some thinking around, whether kind of human generated content is more meaningfully good than artificially generated content, and that's going to raise us some questions, I guess.
Or more nutritious. It's
or
like extremely synthetic food, like the extremely synthetic images of the supermarket are maybe like food without nutrients. And at some point, if you just produce these images with AI, and you hit this recursive wall, right? Like, at what point is that image not good enough? It's like when you have this like an old net art project, or like the classic project where someone will save a file over and over and over and over again until like the artifacts completely corrupt the file. Like at some point we may get there. So maybe the most nutritious thing to feed it is a real picture of a real avocado, you know, like a human picture.
Oil painting.
Yeah, an oil painting. The slowest media you can.
I guess it wouldn't. I mean, like in a way, I was thinking what's interesting about that, which would be a question back to us as humans, whatever. In a way, would be sort of also to ask the question like what, like ask the question of like what would nutritiousness be for an AI, right? Which would then be part of the question of like understanding AI as something that does have a body and needs to be, our bodies have certain things that are nutritious to us in order to sustain our bodies, right? And let us do certain things, etc. So I guess in a way, by asking that in terms of an AI, it's starting to think about the AI as having a body that can be sustained and or not, right?
I mean,
and why do we sustain its body? Is it in a farming sense where we're extracting value from it, or is it in its own sense for its own like experience and value?
Like the quality over quantity is literally the like design principle for AI training now. Like we have reached a point where you have fed the whole internet to like an LLM like ChatGPT. There isn't any more data that you can feed. Okay, sure, there may be some recursive extra data that like, you know, out of the output of talking with GPT, we have a little bit more English text, but we've literally run out of like English tokens. So like, what do you feed? It has to be of good quality, and it cannot just be like more because we've given it everything at this point. So either you have a breakthrough in algorithms, and like what you were talking about earlier in the conspiracy theory around like Hue being this AI that is able to do mathematical problems that are more advanced, like that's a breakthrough that we haven't gotten to yet, but a lot of researchers are working on. On the other hand, the main design problem is like, how do you design a high quality enough data set, like a nutritious enough data set? So definitely it's a
I was also wondering, like this is a kind of possibly too abstract, but I was thinking in a way it could be something similar to like financial speculation and the derivative as this thing that is like, once you can trade every material object, like what do you then trade? And then the derivative is a way where you can trade on the trading of and I guess, you know, a comparison to that, which other people have made, art critics have made, whatever, historians, but like conceptual art is also like a way of seeing like what kind of art do you produce when you've kind of maximalized the actual making of kind of paintings, sculptures, whatever. Conceptual art is like a layer of abstraction above that, which can then be produced and sold, etc., etc. So I don't, I know that that's.
It's like, it reminds me of like parents choosing what music their kids have to listen to in the belly or something. It's like be really selective, otherwise it will have bad taste or something. I think, thank you so much again for your amazing presentation, and good luck on your show in Feb. Thank you.
I mean, we haven't said, but Jen's worked on the performance, the new one, on the Unreal Engine development, so thank you to you too. Okay, cool.